When people think of World War II, they picture tanks, fighter planes, and soldiers charging across battlefields. But here's the reality. Most soldiers didn't die from bullets. They didn't die from tanks. They died from artillery, weapons fired from miles away by enemies they never even saw. From small portable mortars to massive guns the size of buildings, artillery dominated the battlefield. But how did these weapons actually work, and why were they so devastating? At its core, artillery is simple. Weapons designed to strike enemies from long distances. But in World War II, that simple idea evolved into something far more complex. There were different types of artillery, each designed for a specific role. Light artillery, like mortars, field guns, and howitzers. Heavy artillery for destroying fortifications. Rocket artillery for overwhelming attacks, and even experimental weapons that pushed engineering to the limit. Because this war wasn't just about firepower, it was about who could deliver it faster, farther, and more accurately. In many cases, battles were decided before soldiers ever saw each other. The most common and most immediate form of artillery was the mortar. Small, portable, deadly. Weapons like the German 8-centimeter Granatwerfer 34, the American M2 mortar, and the Soviet 82 BM-37 could be carried by just a few soldiers, and within minutes they could start firing. Unlike traditional guns, mortars fired shells in a high arc. That meant they could hit enemies hiding behind cover, inside trenches, behind buildings, or deep in forests. Nowhere was truly safe. For soldiers on the receiving end, it was terrifying. There was no warning, no visible enemy, just the sound of a shell and then impact. Mortars changed everything. Instead of relying on distant artillery units, every infantry squad now had its own indirect firepower, which meant danger could come from anywhere. If mortars were the infantry's weapon, field artillery was the backbone of entire armies. These were the guns that shaped battles. Weapons like the German 10.5 centimeter FH-18, the American M101 howitzer, and the Soviet ZS-3 were used on every front of the war, and they all worked on the same principle. Fire shells over long distances with devastating accuracy. Some fired at high angles, dropping shells from above. Others fired directly, slamming into targets with incredible force. But what made them truly powerful was coordination. Spotters would locate enemy positions, send coordinates back, and within minutes, artillery shells would rain down. Entire areas could be saturated with fire. Before an attack, armies would unleash massive barrages, hours, sometimes days, of non-stop shelling. This was known as an artillery storm. The ground would shake, the sky would darken with smoke, and by the time the barrage ended, there was often very little left. In many battles, the side with more artillery had the advantage. But sometimes, field guns weren't enough. For heavily fortified positions, you needed something bigger, much bigger. Heavy artillery was designed to destroy what nothing else could. Weapons like the German 15-centimeter SFH-18, the Soviet 152mm ML-20, and the British 5.5-inch gun fired massive shells capable of leveling buildings and smashing through reinforced bunkers. These weapons played a critical role in siege warfare. Cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad became battlegrounds of constant bombardment. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, buildings collapsed, streets disappeared under debris. For civilians and soldiers alike, there was no escape. Heavy artillery turned cities into war zones and war zones into ruins. Then came something different, something less precise, but far more terrifying. Rocket artillery, weapons like the Soviet Katyusha and the German Nebelwerfer, didn't rely on accuracy. They relied on overwhelming force. Instead of firing one shell at a time, they launched dozens of rockets in seconds, and the sound was unforgettable. A high-pitched scream as rockets flew through the air. For soldiers on the ground, it created panic, confusion, fear. Rocket artillery wasn't about hitting one target, it was about hitting everything. And when those rockets landed, the effect was chaos. This was one of the earliest forms of what we now call shock and awe. But even that wasn't enough for some, so engineers pushed the limits and built weapons that seemed almost impossible. Massive machines designed to deliver unimaginable firepower, like the Schwerer Gustav. A railway gun so large it had to be transported on tracks. It fired shells weighing several tons, capable of destroying entire fortifications. Or the Karl Gerät, a gigantic self-propelled mortar designed to crush heavily defended targets. These weapons were engineering marvels, but they came with a problem. They were slow, difficult to move, and extremely resource-heavy. By the time they were deployed, the battlefield had often already changed. They were powerful, but impractical. A glimpse of what was possible, but not what was effective. Not all armies used artillery the same way. The Soviets focused on sheer volume. Massive concentrations of guns, firing thousands of shells in coordinated barrages, overwhelming everything in their path. The Germans focused on precision and coordination. Carefully targeted strikes combined with fast-moving units. The Americans emphasized mobility and communication, using advanced radio systems to quickly direct artillery wherever it was needed. Each approach had its strengths, but one thing became clear. It wasn't just about the weapon. It was about how you used it. By the end of the war, one fact stood above all others. Artillery caused more casualties than any other weapon. More than tanks. More than planes. More than rifles. It was the most feared weapon on the battlefield because you couldn't fight it directly. You couldn't see it, and you couldn't escape it. Just the sound of incoming shells was enough to create panic. Artillery wasn't just a weapon. It was an invisible force that controlled the battlefield. When the war ended, artillery didn't disappear. It evolved. Rocket systems like the Katyusha became modern multiple-launch rocket systems. Heavy guns became more accurate, more mobile, more advanced. The lessons learned in World War II shaped military strategy for decades. Even today, artillery remains one of the most powerful forces in warfare. World War II wasn't just fought with bullets, or tanks, or aircraft. It was fought by weapons you never saw, weapons that struck from miles away, weapons that decided battles before they even began. Because in the end, the war wasn't just won on the ground or in the air. It was won by the guns you never heard coming.